In the deepest halls of Hampton Court, where shadows linger longer than light and whispers of the past cling to the stone, a story begins that shaped not only a palace but an entire nation. Behind walls hung with grand tapestries, beyond the polished floors that echoed with the steps of courtiers, there lived a king whose hunger went far beyond power or riches. His desires would dismantle centuries of tradition, spark fear in the hearts of queens, and leave scars across England that can still be felt today. This is not just a tale of palaces, crowns, and ceremonies. It is the dark chronicle of Henry VIII, a man whose passions turned into weapons, where a bedchamber could become a courtroom and a kiss could lead to a death sentence. Before we dive deeper, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss more hidden histories like this. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? When Henry Tudor stepped onto the throne in 1509, he was everything a king was expected to be. Tall, athletic, charming, educated. A golden prince who seemed to belong in the very pages of a romance. People spoke of his dazzling smile, his prowess in tournaments, his love of music, and his love of learning. He seemed like the perfect monarch, and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, gave hope of a bright and stable future for England. But behind the glittering surface was a man with appetites that grew larger and darker with every passing year. Even in those early days, people at court noticed the restless flicker in Henry's eyes. He carried with him a strange conviction that his desires were not only natural but divinely ordained, that his strength in love and lust was proof that God had chosen him above all men. At a time when England still bowed to Catholic law, where marriage was sacred and adultery a sin that could ruin reputations, the court of Henry VIII followed its own set of rules. Here, favor meant survival, and survival often meant giving the king what he wanted, whether it was loyalty, treasure, or flesh. Ladies in waiting lived under a cruel weight. To deny the king was to risk everything, but to give in meant being cast aside the moment his attention shifted. Other European rulers might keep mistresses with discretion, offering them titles and protection. But Henry was different. His pursuits were blunt, overwhelming, and humiliating to those who stood in his way. Catherine, his queen, endured the agony of watching him flaunt his lovers in front of her, forced to smile as young girls barely out of childhood left his chambers draped in jewels, their families suddenly rich with estates. Henry's belief in his own virility was carefully nurtured, both by himself and by those eager to stay in his favor. He was convinced his ability to father children was a divine gift, proof of God's blessing. So when Catherine failed to provide him with a living son, he placed the blame entirely on her shoulders. She aged, she suffered miscarriages, she endured his cold rejection while his mistresses multiplied. Still, she carried herself with dignity, a dignity that only seemed to make Henry angrier. One of his earliest known mistresses was Elizabeth Blunt, known as Bessie, who bore him an illegitimate son in 1519. Henry was so overjoyed at the birth of this healthy boy that he nearly legitimized him, showering him with titles and honors as if to prove to the world that the fault did not lie in his seed, but in his wife. Catherine, meanwhile, was left to watch in silence as her husband celebrated another woman's child. But it was not Bessie Blunt who changed history. It was the arrival of the Boleyn sisters. Mary Boleyn, the elder, soon found herself in Henry's bed. She learned quickly that her role was not to demand, not to question, but to please. When she bore Henry children, perhaps one or even two, he did not acknowledge them as he had Bessie's son. When his passion for her cooled, she was married off and pushed aside, her royal connection left unspoken but impossible to deny. The pattern had begun, and it would repeat itself over and over. Fierce pursuit, gifts, promises, obsession, and then sudden rejection. For Henry, women were not partners but pawns. They were proof of his power, his glory, his strength as a man and king. But Anne Boleyn was different. She would not be played so easily, unlike her sister, and had no interest in becoming just another discarded mistress. She had seen the fate of those who had come before her, and decided she would write a different story. Clever, witty, and ambitious, and kept Henry at arm's length, refusing him while feeding his desire with glances, words, and the promise of what might be. For 7 years, she kept England's most powerful man in a state of burning frustration. And in that frustration, history itself was reshaped. The letters Henry wrote to and still survive, proof of just how far he fell into obsession. In them, the mighty king is reduced to a desperate lover, begging for her, speaking of her body in detail, promising her the world if only she would yield. For the first time, Henry was the pursuer, and it drove him to actions so extreme they would break England away from the Catholic Church itself. Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn was unlike anything England had ever seen. This was not a fleeting desire or another secret mistress kept hidden behind chamber doors, and had drawn a line, and Henry, unused to denial, found himself consumed by the chase. It was not only lust that drove him now, it was pride. He was the king, the supreme figure of England, and yet this woman dared to hold him at bay. That defiance only deepened his determination, twisting it into something that would shake the very foundations of the nation. For 6 long years, Henry fought to end his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. He argued that their union had been cursed from the beginning, that Catherine, once his brother's wife, should never have been his queen. He insisted that their lack of a male heir was proof that God disapproved. But the Pope would not bend. Divorce was forbidden, and the papacy could not risk angering Catherine's powerful nephew, the Emperor of Spain. What began as a private marital dispute grew into a war between England and Rome, with Henry's sexual obsession at its core. Court observers saw the toll it took on him. His moods swung wildly between rage and despair. He grew suspicious, convinced that enemies lurked in every corner, determined to block his marriage to Anne. To him, their refusal was not a matter of law or tradition. It was a direct attack on his God-given right to desire, to conquer, to have what he believed was his. By 1533, Henry had reached a breaking point. With and pregnant, he could no longer wait for the Pope's blessing. He declared his marriage to Catherine invalid, and proclaimed himself the head of the Church of England. In one stroke, he severed England's ties to centuries of Catholic tradition, all for the promise of a son in Anne's womb. To Henry, this was liberation. No priest, no pope, no foreign ruler could tell him who to bed, who to wed, or who to cast aside. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. When Anne gave birth, it was not the long-awaited prince, but a daughter, Elizabeth. The king, who had risked everything for her, now found his passion cooling as swiftly as it had burned. For Anne, the danger was immediate. Catherine had been humiliated but survived, and had no such shield. She had risen too high, made too many enemies, and now stood alone at the center of Henry's waning desire. Within months, Henry's attention turned elsewhere, to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The same cycle began again, whispered words, secret touches, promises of marriage. But this time, Anne could not simply be dismissed. She had been queen, crowned with splendor, and had held Henry's heart in her hands. To remove her, he needed more than rejection. He needed destruction. The charges brought against Anne were as shocking as they were absurd. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. These accusations, designed to stain her memory forever, were less about justice and more about theatre. The trials were a show. The verdict was decided long before evidence was heard. What mattered was the message. The king's passion could raise a woman to the throne, but his disgust could tear her down just as swiftly. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed. She walked to the scaffold with calm dignity, her dark eyes fixed on the crowd, her voice steady as she prayed for the man who had ordered her death. The blade fell, and with it, the hope that Henry's second queen might have been the one to tame his hunger. Almost immediately, Jane Seymour stepped into Anne's place. Within a year, she bore Henry a son, the boy who would become Edward VI. For the first time, Henry's obsession seemed rewarded. Yet joy was fleeting. Jane died only days after childbirth, leaving Henry both grief-stricken and triumphant. He had his son, but the cost had been another wife lost to death, and so the search began again. Henry's counsellors, well aware of his dangerous whims, scoured Europe for a match that might satisfy both the throne and the man. The choice fell on Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose portrait, painted to flatter, showed a woman of grace and beauty. But when Anne arrived in England, Henry recoiled. He called her a great Flanders mare, and declared her repulsive. He claimed he could not even consummate the marriage, sparking humiliating debates in court about the king's own ability rather than his bride's, and endured the insult with remarkable dignity. Their marriage was annulled within months, and Henry, relieved to be rid of her, rewarded her with lands, money, and the title of the king's beloved sister. It was the safest outcome any of his wives would ever know. But Henry was not finished. His eyes fell next on Catherine Howard, and Boleyn's young cousin, barely in her teens. Here, his desires reached their most disturbing depths. Catherine had grown up in a household where older men preyed upon her innocence, and now she was pushed forward by her ambitious family as bait for the king. Henry, obese, plagued by festering wounds, and nearly 50, convinced himself that this teenager adored him. He showered her with jewels, called her his rose without a thorn, blind to the fear in her eyes. But Catherine's past was her undoing. Rumors of earlier relationships surfaced, relationships that today we would recognize as abuse, but which Henry saw as betrayal. His fury was volcanic. To him, it was not enough that she had been touched by others before him. He believed she had shattered his fantasy of youthful purity. In 1542, Catherine Howard was executed. She was so young that it is said she practiced laying her head on the block, trying to learn how to die with dignity. Her story was not just a tragedy of youth and power. It was a reflection of how completely Henry's sexual will had become law, where even a child could be sacrificed to his desires. By the time Henry married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, he was a shadow of the man he had once been. Bloated, ill, with festering wounds and failing health, he could no longer chase passions as he once did. Catherine Parr became less a lover and more a caretaker, nursing him through his final years. Yet even she narrowly escaped his wrath, accused at one point of heresy for her religious beliefs. She survived only by skillful words and careful submission. By the time Henry VIII reached the last years of his reign, the king who had once dazzled Europe as a golden prince had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The man who had danced at banquets, jousted with unmatched skill, and charmed ambassadors with his wit was now a bloated tyrant, weighed down by more than 400 pounds of flesh, a leg wound that oozed and never healed, and a temper that could explode without warning. His desires had slowed, but they had not vanished. Even in decline, he remained dangerous. Catherine Parr, his sixth wife, lived constantly on edge. She had studied the fates of the women who came before her, divorced, executed, or dead, and she knew survival depended on being exactly what Henry needed. Not a passionate lover, but a quiet companion. Not a queen who challenged him, but a nurse who soothed his pain. She read to him, managed his moods, and when her own opinions on religion put her at risk, she quickly recanted, begging forgiveness until the storm passed. In the end, she was the one who outlived him, though even she carried the scars of living in constant fear. But Henry's sexual appetites and his obsessions had already extended far beyond his official marriages. Court records and whispered accounts hint at countless unnamed women, servants who could not refuse, ladies whose families saw advantage in offering their daughters, and foreign visitors who found themselves cornered by a king who believed his desires carried divine authority. Some were rewarded with gifts and sent quietly away. Others, unlucky enough to fall pregnant or cross him in some way, vanished into the shadows of history, their stories never recorded. The most chilling part was the way Henry wrapped his desires in the cloak of religion. As head of the Church of England, he could declare his will to be God's will. Adultery was a sin for others, but for him, it was divine right. His subjects were forced to accept each new marriage as a sacred truth, even when the bodies of the former queens were barely cold. Priests who resisted risked the stake, burned alive for denying the king's shifting commandments. In this twisted world, sexual submission to Henry became a matter of spiritual obedience. The quest for a male heir haunted every decision he made. To Henry, his wives were less women than vessels, their worth measured solely by their ability to produce sons. The irony was brutal. After 6 marriages and countless lovers, he fathered only one legitimate son who survived beyond childhood, Edward VI. Edward would die at just 15, his frail body unable to carry the weight of his father's legacy. The daughters Henry had dismissed, bastardized, and legitimized again according to his whims, Mary and Elizabeth, would each go on to rule, proving that the prize he sacrificed so much for had never been necessary in the first place. The impact on his children was profound. Mary grew up watching her mother humiliated, discarded, and left in misery. Her bitterness shaped her reign, where she earned the name Bloody Mary for burning Protestants in an effort to restore Catholicism. Elizabeth, whose mother and Boleyn was executed when she was not even 3 years old, grew into a cautious woman who never married, perhaps because she knew too well how dangerous love and marriage could be. Even Edward, the golden son, grew up in a court poisoned by paranoia and cruelty, surrounded by men who had seen his father dispose of women as if they were old garments. Beyond the palace walls, the effects rippled through society. Noble families began treating their daughters as pawns in a deadly game. Some pushed their girls toward Henry, hoping for favor and wealth, while secretly fearing the cost if his interest faded. Others hid their daughters away, terrified that royal attention would lead not to glory but to the scaffold. The entire nobility became complicit, bound in a system of exploitation where survival meant silence, and silence meant sacrifice. On the international stage, Henry's desires were equally destructive. His break with Rome isolated England from Catholic Europe, leaving it vulnerable and friendless. His rejection of Catherine of Aragon poisoned relations with Spain for generations. His humiliating treatment of and of Cleves fractured ties with German Protestant states. Each marriage, each divorce, each execution carried diplomatic consequences, watched closely by foreign courts that whispered of England as a land where queens were murdered and religion was reshaped to please one man's lust. Even the law itself bent beneath his will. Parliament and judges rewrote statutes to justify his marriages, his divorces, and his executions. Treason was expanded to include adultery against the king, meaning that failing to please him in bed could become a capital crime. Succession laws shifted back and forth depending on which wife sat beside him. The very idea of justice became a tool in his hands, reshaped to serve desire rather than truth. Historians have long debated what physical or mental conditions may have fueled Henry's decline. Some suggest a head injury from a jousting accident left him prone to rage and paranoia. Others wonder about syphilis or diabetes, conditions that might explain his festering wounds and erratic moods. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a man whose unchecked power and unchecked appetites combined into a storm that devastated everything around him. The legacy of his reign lingered long after he died in 1547. The Church of England, born from his obsession with Anne Boleyn, became a permanent fixture in the nation's identity. The precedent he set, that a king could make himself supreme over church and law to satisfy personal desires, would echo for centuries, fueling conflicts, civil wars, and constitutional crises. The Tower of London, where Anne and Catherine Howard lost their lives, stood as a chilling reminder of the price women paid for failing to meet his impossible demands. And yet, even as time passed, England could never fully escape the scars. Families destroyed, queens executed, children scarred, a nation reshaped, all because of one man who believed his passions were the will of God. The deeper one looks at Henry's reign, the clearer it becomes that his appetites were not confined to the women he married or discarded. They seeped into the very fabric of English society, poisoning law, art, culture, and the way men and women understood power. What began as personal desire became national policy, and what should have been private choices twisted into public nightmares. Women bore the heaviest burden. If queens themselves could be executed on flimsy charges, what chance did ordinary women have? The message was clear. Women existed to serve the desires of men, and even the highest crown offered no real security. The role of queen consort, once seen as a place of honor, was revealed to be entirely conditional, dependent not on loyalty, virtue, or service, but on the fleeting spark of royal lust. Henry's wives learned this cruel truth with their lives, and their fates echoed as warnings to every woman at court. Families, too, were warped by his example. Noble houses began treating daughters as investments, grooming them not for loving marriages, but for the dangerous possibility of catching the king's eye. The Bullens rose to dizzying heights and then fell into ruin, their name forever marked by scandal and blood. The Howards, ambitious and ruthless, pushed forward Catherine Howard, even knowing the danger, sacrificing a girl in hopes of gaining power. Each time, the lesson was the same. Royal favor was a poisoned gift, one that could vanish overnight and leave nothing but disgrace and death. Internationally, England's reputation darkened. Foreign ambassadors reported home in shock, describing a kingdom where queens were put on trial for adultery, where wives were executed, where religion bent and snapped according to the king's desire. Once respected as a civilized Christian realm, England came to be seen as a rogue state, ruled by a man who mistook his bedroom for a throne room. Spanish, French, and German courts whispered about Henry's cruelty, and the consequences stretched across generations. His treatment of Catherine of Aragon poisoned relations with Spain. His betrayal of Anne of Cleves damaged ties with German Protestants. His open challenge to the Pope fractured England's place in Christendom forever. Even the arts suffered. In earlier times, England had cultivated a rich tradition of poetry, song, and stories of courtly love. Under Henry, artists and writers learned to tread carefully. Portraits of wives were hidden or destroyed, their very images considered dangerous reminders of fallen queens. Poets who once celebrated romance turned instead to flatter the king's current marriage, producing verses that were more propaganda than art. Creativity shrank beneath the weight of fear, replaced by careful praise and hollow flattery. The economy felt the strain as well. Henry's break with Rome led to the dissolution of the monasteries, seizing vast church lands and wealth to fill royal coffers and fund his endless cycle of marriages. Monastic libraries were scattered, treasures were lost, and centuries of scholarship were dismantled in the name of royal desire. The noble houses that opposed him were crushed, their wealth confiscated, their families broken. Entire fortunes were redirected not for the kingdom's prosperity, but to support the pageantry and cost of his weddings and annulments. England's economy was reshaped to feed the hunger of one man. Law itself was twisted into something unrecognizable. Adultery against the king became treason, a crime punishable by death. Succession laws were rewritten again and again depending on which queen was in favor. Parliament bent to Henry's will, approving whatever marriage or execution he demanded. Courts became theatres, where trials served not to discover truth, but to display obedience to the monarch. The very idea that law should stand above the desires of a ruler collapsed under Henry's reign. replaced by the terrifying precedent that the king's will was the law. Psychologists looking back often wonder what drove him. Some point to the head injury from his jousting accident, which may have damaged his brain and unleashed the paranoia, mood swings, and bursts of rage that defined his later years. Others speculate about syphilis, diabetes, or other illnesses that left him bloated, infertile, and constantly in pain. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. A man who had once been bright and athletic decayed into a monster whose appetites outlived his strength. What made Henry truly dangerous was not illness alone, but the way absolute power allowed him to indulge those appetites without limit. No court could restrain him, no church could challenge him, no noble could oppose him without risking their head. The structures of religion and government bent until they broke, reshaped around the hunger of one man. And when a ruler's desires become law, the line between bedroom and battlefield vanishes. The cultural memory of Henry's reign became unforgettable. His wives were reduced to a grim rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. School children repeated it for centuries, turning human tragedy into a sing-song history. The figures became archetypes: the scheming family offering their daughters, the lustful tyrant whose passion turned deadly, the disposable queen who rose and fell with terrifying speed. These patterns burned themselves into England's imagination, resurfacing whenever later monarchs faced scandal. Even architecture carried the marks. Palaces were altered, emblems destroyed, initials carved away when one queen was replaced by another. Jewels and gowns passed from wife to wife, leaving behind an inventory of broken promises. Hampton Court and the Tower of London became haunted in more ways than one, not just by the echoes of history, but, as stories claim, by the screams of queens who met their end within their walls. Catherine Howard's ghost is still said to run through Hampton Court, crying for mercy that never came. Henry's legacy also reshaped gender itself. He presented a vision of manhood built on domination, conquest, and cruelty, where virility was measured not by love or loyalty, but by the number of women possessed and discarded. Men learned to copy this model, believing that cruelty was justified by desire. Women, meanwhile, saw that even queens could be destroyed, and their lives became lessons in caution and silence. Elizabeth I's famous refusal to marry may well have been a direct response to her father's reign, an act of self-preservation in a world where marriage to a king was as dangerous as war. And yet, for all his cruelty, Henry never seemed to see himself as a monster. Even on his deathbed, he showed no sign of regret. He believed God had sanctioned his every move, every broken marriage, every execution. In his mind, his will and divine will were the same. That belief, unchecked and absolute, reshaped England for centuries. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, England was left to reckon with more than just the loss of a monarch. His body was lowered into the grave beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a legitimate son. Even in death, he ranked his wives by usefulness, not by love or loyalty. Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr were left out of his burial plans, their memories reshaped to fit the story he wanted to leave behind. But the truth could not be buried so easily. The scars of his reign ran deep. His religious break with Rome had permanently divided England from the rest of Catholic Europe, fueling wars, rebellions, and centuries of conflict. The Church of England, born not from holy reform but from one man's desire to have another woman, became a permanent institution, shaping English identity to this day. Every hymn sung, every prayer whispered in Anglican churches carries the echo of that original sin, a church built not from faith but from lust and power. Politically, he left behind a kingdom where law had bent until it snapped. The precedent was set. The king's desires could reshape the nation itself. Successions rewritten, treason expanded, courts twisted. These would haunt England long after his death. Even the civil wars of the 17th century carried the shadow of Henry's legacy, as Parliament and kings clashed over the limits of royal power. The seeds of that conflict had been sown in the day Henry declared himself above both pope and priest, above church and law. For his family, the trauma was personal and generational. Mary Tudor, scarred by her mother's humiliation, burned heretics in a desperate attempt to undo the Protestant changes her father had set in motion. Elizabeth, her half-sister, learned from her mother's beheading and her stepmother's fate, choosing never to marry, ruling as a virgin queen who kept control of her throne by keeping men at arm's length. Even Edward, the long-awaited son, was sickly and short-lived, a symbol of how Henry's desperate quest for a male heir had been both fruitless and fatal. Ordinary people, too, lived under the shadow of his tyranny. Families lost daughters to the king's bed, knowing resistance meant ruin. Priests were executed for refusing to recognize his marriages. Servants whispered of what they had seen, but dared not speak openly. A culture of fear spread through court and country, where even the most private matters of the king's bedroom became matters of state security. Silence was survival. Economically, his reign was ruinous. The dissolution of the monasteries had poured money into royal coffers for a time, but it also shattered communities, destroyed schools, hospitals, and libraries that the monasteries had maintained for centuries. The executions of nobles redistributed wealth, not for the good of the realm, but for the king's endless hunger for ceremonies, feasts, and weddings. England's economy was reshaped not by trade or innovation, but by the cycle of lust, rejection, and blood. The cultural impact lasted even longer. Writers and artists, who might have given England a flourishing renaissance, instead spent their talents praising whatever queen sat beside Henry at the moment. Fear silenced creativity. Whole libraries were burned or scattered. Art became propaganda, and truth became dangerous. Even centuries later, when playwrights and novelists revisited the Tudors, they returned again and again to the women Henry destroyed, trying to restore humanity to figures history had reduced to pawns. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was the way his reign normalized cruelty. With every execution, every annulment, every humiliation carried out in the name of royal desire, Henry taught England that power justified anything. To challenge him was to risk death. To serve him was to surrender one's dignity. The state bent to his whims, teaching generation after generation that law and religion could be tools of tyranny if wielded by the wrong hands. And yet, for all his violence and appetites, Henry VIII remains a figure that fascinates. Tourists walk the halls of Hampton Court and the Tower of London, eager to glimpse the places where queens were crowned and then condemned. They stare at portraits of Henry, still imposing in his broad shoulders and jeweled finery, and wonder how such a king could be both glorious and grotesque. Stories of Anne Boleyn's ghost, of Catherine Howard's desperate screams, of Jane Seymour's spectral presence at Hampton Court, keep alive the memory of women whose lives were consumed by one man's hunger. Even today, the rhyme lingers: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It turns 6 women's tragedies into a schoolyard chant, reducing their lives to a list, their deaths to a rhythm. But behind that rhyme lies blood, fear, and the silence of those who could not speak. It is a reminder that history often smooths over its darkest truths, turning horror into memory, memory into story, story into rhyme. Henry's reign stands as one of history's sharpest warnings. It shows how personal desire, when combined with unchecked power, can twist into tyranny. It shows how a nation can become complicit, families sacrificing daughters, priests twisting scripture, nobles bending laws, all to satisfy the cravings of a single man. And it shows how the scars of that tyranny do not vanish with death, but echo for centuries, reshaping faith, politics, culture, and even the way men and women see each other. The Golden Prince, who began his reign full of promise, ended it as a bloated tyrant, surrounded by shadows and haunted by ghosts of the women he destroyed. He believed to his last breath that his will was divine, that his passions were God's passions. But the truth was far darker. His obsessions fractured his kingdom, poisoned his family, and left behind a legacy of fear. Even now, England carries the marks of his reign. In its church, in its law, in its culture, the shadow of Henry VIII lingers. He confused his bed with his throne, his hunger with God's command. And for that, thousands suffered, and an entire realm was reshaped. This is the story of Henry VIII, not the glorious Renaissance king painted in gold, but the predator whose desires turned a palace into a prison, a kingdom into a theater of cruelty, and a people into silent witnesses of tyranny. A reminder that unchecked power, once claimed, can consume everything, leaving behind only ghosts, scars, and warnings for the